South Africa did not choke. In 1906, South Africa needed 284 to win. They'd only passed 100 in half their test innings at that point. At 105 for 6, it seemed impossible. They fought back but lost another flurry, leaving 45 to win with 1 wicket in hand. At the crease was Dave Norse, who was a capable batter, and he was joined by Percy Sherwell, the only debutant captain keeper and number 11 in Test cricket history. And these two were doing it. A huge crowd in South Africa cheered on every single run. With 8 left, Sherwell edged between slips for 4. Straight after, Norse ran a 3. England bowled 3 dots. All they needed was 1 wicket to tie. Instead, a leg side full toss, boundary, game over. This was Test cricket's first 1 wicket win, and their last partnership was a record for almost 100 years. But it was also something else. This was the first Test match that South Africa had ever won. Buy my book on Amazon, Overthrowing Cricket's Empire. Name and job title, please.
Paul Radley. I'm a sports writer for the national newspaper in the UAE and the author of Playing to Fix.
Do you know, I've had this book on my desk for so long because I really wanted to read it. And I'm going to explain to everyone now why I wanted to read it. Not just because it's an interesting story, but because you are the start of the Good Areas Network. The first thing that we ever did on this network was the Red Inca podcast. And the first episode was you coming on to talk about this story that is in this book, which is crazy. And I think I felt like I dragged you on and you were like, are you sure this is what you want to do? And part of the reason is I wanted to tell interesting stories that kind of, not the Crick Info and Crick Buzz wouldn't cover, but they wouldn't give as much time to. And I also thought if I could get people to listen to UAE cricketers who have gone missing from a tournament, I think I can make a whole business around this business model. So yeah, you're still the first ever episode. You're there at the very start of the Good Areas Network. But let's just go through why I think this is, why it was interesting to me. I think at one stage I was more interested in this topic than you were. And I think I poked you so much that you were like, maybe Jared's right. But I was working for Scotland, and it was the 2018 T20 qualification? 2019. So 2019 T20 qualifiers. I was a Scotland analyst. We turned up for a practice game. So we had a practice game against Ireland, which I think was like a tie or something ridiculous. Or maybe it was like, come down to the last ball. And we were like, oh, they're playing pretty good cricket. We're playing pretty good cricket. We felt really good. And then we turned up to play the UAE in a warm-up game. And all the research I'd done on the UAE players meant absolutely nothing, Paul, because there was just a bunch of players I'd never heard of before, and I didn't know where these guys had come from. They absolutely flogged us. And because I was in analyst mode, I think I was asking you questions along the lines of, what's happening here? It turned out at that stage that, a third of the UAE squad, who was originally supposed to play in those T20 World Cup qualifiers, didn't end up finishing the tournament. So I'll let you take it from there. Why did they not finish that tournament?
Yeah, I remember you coming and asking about these guys, and I was like, well, I've been covering UAE cricket for ages, and there's 2 blokes in there who I don't even know anything about. They were literally, so on the eve of the tournament, 3 guys got chucked out. So it must have been just before. So it was just between. So what you were talking about, those warm-up matches would have been the official warm-up matches. So
yes.
They had a couple of unofficial ones just beforehand, because obviously the teams had arrived already. And they had one against Namibia at the Boys Sports City on one of the academy ovals there. And at the end of the game, there was a horrible atmosphere, and I was like, what's going on? So UAE were one of the 2 highest ranked teams. It was your boys, Scotland, and the UAE were the 2 of the highest ranked teams in a 14-team tournament where 6 teams went through. So they were odds on to go through.
Yeah.
And so they were playing really good cricket at that time. And then this last warm-up game they played against Namibia, they lost with 10 overs to spare by about, it might have been, I think it was a 10 wicket loss as well. They were completely smashed, and there was just an awful atmosphere on the field. And I was like, what's this all about? I'd only gone up there to do some preview stuff for the newspaper that I work for. And then noticed that players that should have been playing, like the captain, he was on the side of the field. That's Mohammed Naveed. Shaiman Anwar looked really sheepish, and another guy called Kadir were all just like, they were totally out of sorts. And then you noticed that some ACU staff had come from the office, which the ICC office is in, like you can see it from the field that you're at. They'd obviously come to the ground, and those three players, Naveed, Kadir, and Shaiman, who were very important players in the team. Well, Naveed was the captain, Shaiman was the best batter, and Kadir was a decent bowler as well. Got led away, and then from there, it all just exploded, basically. So those three were just the start of it as well. Like you said, it ended up being a third. There were two more players during the competition, like one guy, Ashfaq Ahmed, who was actually really good opening batter for them, got chucked out after two matches of the tournament. And then that same evening, the wicketkeeper, Ghulam Shabir, did a moonlight, basically. He left the country without telling anyone. So, yeah, they were really...
I mean, that was the big one, because I remember being with all the associate teams. I think half the teams were in our hotel, right? You know, we had the Dutch, Singapore, I can't remember who else, but there were like heaps of teams in our hotel, and then there was a bunch of other teams in Abu Dhabi. But every time you went to a ground, and there was crossover as well, like whether you're in the hotel or at the ground, everyone was like, have you heard that there's just like a UAE player missing? Like that, and I think you broke that story, if I remember correctly. But like, it was suddenly like everyone was like, this isn't just, it felt like it had gone beyond corruption. People were like, has he disappeared? Has he been murdered? You know, like no one knew exactly what the situation was. And while this is all happening, of course, the UAE have gone from, as you said, probably dead certainties to qualify for the World Cup in their own environment to falling away as a team, right? Like they struggled on. Was it UAE who got bounced out by the Netherlands in Dubai right towards the end, where you're just like it was a wild game, because we're in Dubai. I remember Richard Doan had driven me over from the other grounds. You know, so some of the grounds were played out, games were played out the back, and then some were played in the main stadium. And he drove me over because I wanted to have a look at that game. I was not expecting to see the UAE team bounced out by the Dutch. I know the Dutch had good fast bowling, but it was like, I didn't know half of the UAE players. I didn't know what was going on. And it was just during that tournament, it just felt like the whole thing, it felt like UAE cricket was about to just collapse.
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah, I remember that game, and it would have been important for you because that game, because they lost that, they had to play Scotland in the decisive game, where the winner of that game went to the World Cup. But yeah, that Netherlands game just went to show that everything was against them, because they're in home conditions, even though it's an ICC competition. The stadium they play at all the time, and they going in and playing against the Dutch, and suddenly they've got a fresh wicket, an absolute green top that's flying through, and they're like, "What have we done? What have we done to deserve this?" And they had like players in that squad, because Ghulam had gone. They literally fished. Ghulam had been located in his hometown in Pakistan by this point. And they'd fished a boy, Vritti Aravind, who's had a very good career since then, but at that point he was 17. They'd fished him out of his he was well happy, because it meant he didn't have to do his mock psychology exam, his A-level exam, and he could go and play in this cricket tournament instead. And because Ghulam had literally fled in the night with nothing apart from his rucksack, they had him on CCTV footage at the front of the hotel. He just had his rucksack. He left his cricket kit and everything. When I eventually caught up with him, he said, "I'm done with cricket. I don't care about my kit or anything." So Vritia had come out of school, didn't have to do his A-level mock exam, was playing. Suddenly, he didn't actually play in the tournament, but he's part of this international team. And he managed to tea leaf a load of Ghulam's kit as well, because Ghulam didn't have any use for it anymore. So he was well happy.
From there, at that stage, that's kind of when the world stops worrying about it. I mean, I probably got you on the podcast not long after to talk about that, but that's about the stage where the world stops worrying about it, and UAE cricket goes through a bit of a dip and then has rebuilt quite well over time since then. When do you think there's a book in this?
Well, actually, funny enough, when I mentioned it in the acknowledgement of the book, when you got me on to speak about it on Red Inca, I thought, well, you know, if Jared's interested in it, then maybe this does go beyond the, like you say, beyond the sort of boundaries of the pretty narrow, let's be honest, the very narrow boundaries of UAE cricket, because it's a story about match fixing and the perils of it, but also it's a really interesting human interest story about these guys who have fallen into this, whether they be dodgy and corrupt by nature, or whether they've just been unlucky in life and made some dodgy decisions. And you've got to remember that these lads weren't that weren't very well paid for playing cricket for the UAE, and it was their profession. These guys are of a profile where they're all of that team were in their, at least in their 30s, if not like mid 30s to late 30s. Shyman, I think, was even in his 40s. So, that's easy prey basically for corruptors. These guys know that they're coming towards the end of their career, and they've not got many qualifications to do anything else. What they're going to do next? If they get told, you can make some money for doing something that probably seems like not too bad to them, bowl a few wides here and there, go for a certain amount in a certain amount of overs, or bat slowly through the power play, something like that, for instance. It probably didn't seem too bad to them, but they've completely lost their cricket careers as a result, and have lost all of their respect, really, because whenever you see any of their names, like Naveed was making a real name for himself as a cricketer, but if if his kids now click on Google and they search up their dad, then that's always going to be attached to his name now, the fact that he was banned for match fixing. Oh, sorry, spot fixing, I should say.
Let's get back to the pay for a minute, because it's really interesting. The whole thing with UAE cricket, I remember during the 2015 World Cup, when their sponsor was an Indian company that came in at the last minute because the UAE wasn't going to have a sponsor on their shirts. And I pointed out how ridiculous it was that the umpires of all people are sponsored by Emirates, and the cricketers can't get a sponsor. They won't even sponsor their own cricket team. You go to the nets, and you would have seen this before. There are all these like young, hungry guys, who really want to play cricket, and they stay in the nets all day, quite often in 40, 45 degree heat. When we were there, we had an intervention. I think it was Scotland and Bermuda had an intervention to say to the ICC, you have to give these guys food and drink. They are literally bowling all morning and all afternoon. That's how bad the conditions were there. Dubai is this huge business, but as we know, the immigrant community is not treated that same way, and the cricketers are just thrown in on the end. So you have this beautiful cricket stadium, and then you have these guys who are not getting paid any money. How little does in that period was a UAE cricketer getting paid to play for the country?
Yeah, so they had 3 subsets of contracts. The starting one was 6,000 dirhams a month, which is back then was probably, I think it's about the same now, as probably about 1,200-ish, $1,500 dollars. And then the higher band, it just goes up incrementally to about $2,600. So, that's not much. And then on top of that, they can make like a bit of extra money for match fees for playing for A division teams over here. But then you're like, you're cobbling together your per diems that you get for being on a match day or whatever. Yeah. And then, they get additional match fees here and there, but it's in that sort of region basically. So, not the, some countries like Nepalese players might look at that and think, well, that's not a bad wage. But then obviously you've got living costs over here. And also these players, they're international sportsmen, but they're not, they haven't got the cachet of international sportsmen from elsewhere, basically, because people don't really know them that way. Like you mentioned, like here in this country, cricket is massive. I can walk down the street now and would take me 1 minute to bump into somebody who knew loads about cricket, but they don't necessarily know much about UAE cricket, or if anything at all.
Yeah.
They haven't really got much celebrity at all, the team, and that makes quite a big difference in terms of obviously their earning potential, but also in terms of how they regard themselves. They look at these other players from other countries and they don't really see themselves on the same footing as them, even though a lot of the time they're good enough to compete with them.
Yeah, and so you're right. That even when I read the national, like you would cover the UAE team, but the most of the coverage in UAE is generally done for the Indian, Pakistan, maybe Sri Lankan teams, right? Like it's the international side of things that is the main part of it. And so yeah, I can understand that. When do you think they went from being players happy to play for the UAE to starting to be involved in the spot fixing?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure I'd be able to answer, because this story stemmed from the Zimbabwe series. Now I can't remember when that was. I think that was about maybe 6 months before this tournament. So they had this series in Zimbabwe of four one-day internationals that was basically put on just for fixing. They had sponsors who were fictitious,
Oh,
who were backed by people who are now banned from the game. They're called excluded persons by the ICC, the anti-corruption people, because they don't have an official involvement in cricket, so they can't get them as being participants in cricket. So they've not been a player, they've not been
yeah,
a official, they've not been a coach or anything like that. So they can't get an official ban from cricket, like for however many years, but they're excluded from the game. It's quite difficult to. Well, I'd have thought it's quite difficult to police it first of all, but yeah, it's also quite difficult to describe the differences because they're not actually involved
yeah.
in the game officially, but they are. They did. So these people who are excluded by the ICC because of their involvement in corruption put on this series with a fictitious sponsor called Surya Pumps. Don't know what that was supposed to relate to. And basically, the UAE players who were involved in, who have subsequently been banned, were approached and, basically involved at that stage. So that was a few months before. Whether it would be going on previous to that, who knows?
And you covered the backstories here. I know Mohammed Naveed doesn't really admit to being involved with fixing. What about some of the other players?
Occasionally, I also talk about behind the scenes stuff. Huge thanks to everyone who has supported us on Patreon and helped us build this channel. Join our Patreon community and unlock exclusive benefits. Enjoy AMAs, live calls with me, and connect with fellow cricket enthusiasts on Discord.
None of them have ever said, they've all denied ever fixing matches. What they've been charged for and thrown out for is basically colluding with known corruptors and not reporting that. They've basically all acknowledged that happened. So, fill in the gaps between the two. But none of them have ever said they've been involved in actually fixing matches. They've never come clean on that. But certain players, like Kadir came back. Kadir is the first player who's come back. His ban ended in October, and he's always said, "I'm sorry for what I've done." So I've always taken that to be, as close to an admission of guilt as you get, basically.
A big part of the book is following the backstories, right? Which is, as a cricket writer, you're always aware of people's backstories, but you probably went a lot deeper. Like, what shocked you about some of the things that you found out about these guys?
Well, not in terms of their backgrounds. Not a lot shocked me because I've always that's always been my interest, is finding out about people and the human side, the background that they have. So I sort of knew a lot of their backgrounds. Like Naveed, the captain, I loved covering his story for the whole time he was part of the UAE team, because he came over from an area in Pakistan because his mates who were already living in Corfacam, which is way out, like a couple of hours away over here on the other side of the country. He came to visit his mates just for a bit. He stayed with them there on a tourist visa, stayed with them, played in their tape ball cricket team. And they're like, "Oh, Naveed, stay. You're brilliant at tape ball. Stay with us." And he was like, yeah, okay, I'm not doing anything else. I might as well stay on for a bit. So he managed to get himself a job over there in Corfacam. I think he was working in maybe a cigarette factory, so I might have mixed my stories. That might have been the job that he had back in his hometown in Pakistan. That's why he was working for the in the free zone in Fujairah. Sorry, that's details that just stick in my mind. And his mates were saying to him, "Look, Naveed, you're brilliant at table cricket. You're really, really good. Why don't you go to Sharjah when the UAE are training and see if you can impress them?" And so he got on 2 public buses to get there. That's like probably, you're talking 2.5 hours for that journey on the bus. He went to Sharjah Stadium, bowled in the nets there, like with a leather ball for the first time. Didn't really know what he was doing. Bowled about 10 balls in front of Kabir Khan, who was the coach at the time. And Kabir was like, "Right, we're having you. You're brilliant. So, and that was how his life started. And I even went to cover a tournament, did a big long read on it actually in the National on tape ball tournament. So when he had played in the World Cup in 2015. He was, I think, the UAE captain by this point, and he was going back to play in a tape ball cricket match on a purpose-built. It wasn't a street. It's like a purpose-built concrete pitch where they could play in the night. So they put floodlights inside the field so that the batters could see the ball, and there would be like a 500 dirham prize for man of the match or whatever. And Naveed would go, and this match would be starting during Ramadan. This match would start at like 12:30 a.m. and him and his mates would be playing, and it would mean just as much to him, Naveed, playing in that as it would for the UAE. So I felt like, this guy, this is such a lovely story that this guy's made a career for himself, made a life for himself out of cricket, when this is the cricket he's been brought up on. This career he's played as an adult, and he still plays it now. It seems absolutely lovely to me. And then to find out that, everything that happened to him subsequently with him being, found to be involved in what he was involved in. I just found that so sad, really. And it was a lot of the story, a lot of writing the book was, it's quite hard, really, finding out that he'd do something like that. But then also, because of the wages that they're on, understandable as well. So it's provoked quite conflicting feelings, really, writing the book.
Well, one of the chapters is called From Dismissing Rohit Sharma to Selling Milk.
Yeah, Kadir, shame. He's had a tough time, Kadir. Funny enough, I was just reading that chapter to try and refresh my memory on it this morning. Kadir is one that I think that shocked all of the other players in the team more than anybody else. Shaiman, everybody had their doubts. Naveed, everybody was disappointed with, but given the circles that he was starting to mix in terms of the franchise cricket that he's playing in, you'd have exposure to loads of different people, so it'd be easy for him to get dragged in. Kadir didn't really have any of that. He was just a simple guy. He was exactly what you just said about the bowlers. When they're bowling in like 40 degrees, they're net bowlers. That was him. And Chirag Suri, one of the UAE teammates, really good young player back in that team then, he would say, we could just say to Kadir, carry on bowling. Come on, I want to keep batting. Carry on bowling, and he just would. He said, Chirag. I think it's a really important quote in the book. Actually, Chirag said, "You could just ask Kadir because he would just never say no." And I think that might have been Kadir's problem when he was exposed to people who had, corrupt ideas in mind. He just couldn't say no to them.
You talked about it being sad. This is a team that you had invested a lot of time in, right? Like as a sports writer, at a certain point, like you're objective and you're on the outside, but it's a UAE team. You're like the de facto 12th man in some of these in some of these situations, right? And you're the person covering UAE cricket as well as anyone else ever has. So you have a professional stake in them, right? Did it break your heart a little bit?
Yeah.
When I suppose there's two times it could have broken your heart. The first one is when it happens, but the second one is when you really start to understand what happens next.
Yeah, it's really interesting, that question, because I was obviously slightly conflicted because I knew these people. I told Naveed's story a lot. Kadir the same, like all of them really. But it's amazing how quickly you do flip and think, well, actually, there's quite a big story as well. So,
Yeah.
it didn't take much for me to, realize this is a hard news story, pursue it as though it is. So even if you've had nice dealings with these guys and you're going to have to cover the team all the way in the future, this is your job. You've got to do this. And, so it was conflicting, but it was also quite energizing from that point of view, because these sort of stories, they don't drop in your lap very often, and this is my beat, so I needed to do the job properly, whatever had gone before. But it did break my heart as well. Yeah.
And you sort of follow the players back to Pakistan, right? Like, and you followed that next step. You had seen them take the wickets of Rohit Sharma and Mohammad Naveed. I remember working with an agent for him, trying to get him into franchise leagues. These are proper cricketers. These aren't like just, amateur cricketers who got lucky. These were proper cricketers with proper skills. And then you're following them back in what's happening next. Like, even if you see them as fixers and corrupt and, whatever your mental space is while you're doing this, you're watching human beings that you had a relationship with going through the worst moments probably of their life, right? Like, outside of perhaps health concerns they might have or family concerns they might have, this is probably the worst thing that's going to happen to them.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Just talking about Naveed, he came from nothing to be an international cricketer, and then it all went away again, and he was back with nothing. Kadir as well. His story is a really, really sad one. So he went home. I was just reading it to my wife actually. She was like, "Oh no, this is awful." So when he came here to Dubai, he lived in a room with his brother, who was already working as a security guard here. Ended up making his way in cricket. Was doing so well. This happened. Had to go back to Pakistan. His wife, so they started a family while he was unemployed, while he was trying to make the milk business work. So he's having to provide now for another dependent without any regular income. And within sort of 4 months of his son being born, he's like, well, I cannot provide. So he had to come back to Dubai, and he was panicked because when I don't know who he was trying to say this it was telling him this, whether it was his friends or whether the AC, I mean, I'm sure it wasn't the ACU, but whether somebody was giving him the hard sell at the time, trying to get him to admit to his actions when he was being investigated. He was told that he was gonna go to jail and rot, or he's going to be hanged or whatever, some scare stories. So he was, for him to make that jump from leaving a country where he thought that this was his future, like he was facing all these recriminations because of what he'd done, to then think, well, I've got nothing else. I have to find a job that pays for my family. So he ended up coming back here to Dubai from his home in Pakistan and working he had a few different jobs, but working for, Kareem, what's the equivalent of Kareem? Like Deliveroo? Uber Eats, that sort of thing. So his job, he had like basically 200 motorcycles that he had to make sure that if there were any scratches on them, they were it was rubbed out, or if he had to make sure the licenses were up to date and everything like that. So that was his job when he came back here, and then I think he's established himself a bit more now. And then recently he got to play cricket again for the first time in 4 years. So things are picking up for him, but following like their rise and then their fall. It provokes a few conflicting thoughts in you, definitely.
So I've been thinking about this a lot recently. So obviously I just did a big expose on stuff that has gone on in the BPL, and there might be recriminations for some of the players that I've that have been involved in some of those leagues and some of the T20 leagues coming up, and every now and again there's a new story that so and so has been suspended and all this sort of stuff. We still in cricket, I think, blame the players. And I don't think we have quite understood just the kind of pressure that is put on by quite often organized crime syndicates, right? Like, we've all seen The Sopranos, but somehow in cricket we think, oh, this player's made that decision. We haven't quite put in all that sort of stuff. And also, everyone makes mistakes in life, and some of these guys made mistakes, and then it's going to haunt them for the rest of their time. Does it change because you know the full stories from, as you said, from the beginning through to the peak, all the way through to the trough again? Do you have a different feel for match fixing now than you did perhaps before you started this?
100%, definitely. Yeah, I would not be as judgmental as I would have been before. I'm sure it just feels a shame to talk about people who have suffered this fate. But Mohamed Amir is playing here now in the ILT20 for Desert Vipers. If you look at Mohamed Amir, I do anyway, my first thought is what he did and what he was banned for. And that's ages ago. There's so much passed under the bridge since then. He's done so well in the Champions Trophy, Pakistan winning that. He does so. He is, even though he's like a gunfire and these T20 franchises, and they don't mean that much, these tournaments. He is always so invested in the games. He's invested in helping his teammates, and by all accounts from his Desert Vipers teammates who aren't like his Pakistan teammates who wouldn't have known him before anyway, he's been absolutely brilliant. I think they said the same at Essex when Essex had some success when he was there. He is so popular, and it is such a shame that a guy who was 17 at the time or whatever he was, very, very young, has been tarred with that for basically his whole life. I remember Dougie Brown in the book says it's reputational damage is the big thing. You can't put a Band-Aid over it and forget about it. It sticks with you forever, and that's what these guys are stuck with. And having seen, like we said, the peaks and then the real troughs that they've been through, and now having delved into it for the book, understood why they might be swayed to do these things, it makes me think totally differently about it. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think it's kind of where I want cricket to get to now. And it's weird. It reminds me of the chucking thing as well. The other kind of chucking. When originally you go back and it was almost seen as like a character defect if you chucked. Right? Like you were either trying to cheat or, there was something morally wrong with you and you couldn't straighten your arm. And then through Murally and sports science, we start to understand things a little bit more. And, I still want chucking to eventually just be what it should be, which is a no ball. You came in and you were trying to bowl with a straight arm on that last delivery, and it wasn't. Umpire puts his arm out and it's a free hit in the T20 cricket and it's a no ball in Test cricket, right? Like that's where we should get to. But there's so much. I remember when I worked for Cricinfo, they always said you can't accuse anyone of chucking because we'll get sued for libel, right? Because it was seen as like the most heinous thing to blame anyone for. And realistically, as I just said, it's a no ball, and that's literally what it says in the laws and the playing conditions. Is that's what it should be. And it's the same with fixing. Like I understand why people get really upset. I remember Muhammad Amir one's really, really interesting. When Muhammad Amir made his comeback, he was at Lord's. And in front of him, behind him when he was out on the boundary was JP Morgan sign. So I just Googled crimes JP Morgan, right? Fraud JP Morgan, whatever it was. Just to see. I didn't know anything about JP Morgan. It came up with, a bunch of UK pensioners had lost in investments and, they had to pay big fines for all these different things, right? And they could proudly put their name up on Lord's. And, I think they had the press box at that stage as well. I think it was the JP Morgan press box at that stage. I can't remember if it still is. I'm not having a go at JP Morgan, but no one ever puts those two things together. And I put this tweet out and it annoyed people. That's not the same thing. He sold out his country and his sport and everything. And it's like, no, he's a young guy who made a mistake. Maybe was forced into it, maybe was tricked into it, but made a mistake for financial reasons, and he's going to have to live with it for the rest of his life. Whereas most of the world's biggest financial institutions, banks, companies, all these sorts of things, we just forget about the same sorts of things that they do over and over again. And I understand how sport works. Like I'm not having a go at sports fans, but I think the more you get in with these sorts of situations, and I've been lucky enough to spend some time with some people who've been involved in this sort of stuff. Sri Santh was one who I spent quite a lot of time with, but I've talked to a couple of people off the record who haven't quite felt comfortable coming on the record with me. But you talk to them and they're just like, I just made a mistake and I couldn't get out of the mistake, and it just then it doubles down, then it triples down, then it quadruples down. You can imagine what it must be like to be in a point where you are fleeing your teammates, you're fleeing in the middle of a World Cup and you're going home. If you leave the UAE the way that it was, who was it that fled? Was it Ghulam?
Ghulam should be, yeah.
Oh, sorry, you there? Oh, did we just cut out for a second? Can you hear me now?
I've got you. Yeah, you're back.
Yep. Who was it? Who was it that fled? Who was the player that fled? Oh, what's going on here? Full Wi-Fi for both of us. Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're back, mate. Yeah, I don't know if might have been my Wi-Fi.
It might be. I can't tell. I mean, it says we've both got full Wi-Fi, so I don't understand why we can't hear each other. Sorry, what was the name of the wicketkeeper that fled?
Ghulam Shabir. Yeah.
So I'll just take off from there. So you look at someone like Ghulam, who literally has a life in the UAE. He's making more money than he's probably going to make in Pakistan. He's playing cricket at the highest level that he's probably ever going to play it at. For him to get into a position where he flees and has to give all that up, forget everything else. It just tells you how dramatic that moment was, and how he would have at that stage understood that every bad decision he had made had led him to that point. That's just a normal human making mistakes, but that's not the way we kind of think about it, is it?
Yeah, you're right. The Ghulam case, like you said, that was really dramatic. So they'd gone out for dinner. Three of the players, Usman, Ashfaq, and Ghulam. And Ghulam. Sorry, did I say Mohammed Usman, who was a batter who was he did really well in the tournament, and he'd come out of this whole situation with the players who were corrupt and ones that were fleeing and whatever. He's come out of that with flying colours, basically, because he made sure he held everyone to account as much as he could. So they came back from that, and he knew nothing about Ghulam fleeing, even though they'd had dinner together that night. So yeah, I mean, it was extremely dramatic. But in actual fact, Ghulam, probably a slightly different case to the one that you've just said, really, because Ghulam did have, he obviously had better earning potential here than he would do back in Pakistan.
Yeah.
However, he was up to date on his rent, but he had a few other debts here as well. So there were, basically that just goes to show that he was easy prey for somebody.
Yeah.
The only thing I would say on this is, I am more understanding of these guys, but I still think there needs to be a deterrent. You can't say, I don't think you can say, if you fix, I understand, they're there. Whatever your situation, the players need to understand. And I think, as far as I can tell, ICC's anti-corruption unit do their best to show this to them, is that nothing will be improved by you taking the money and doing these fixes. Whatever situation you're in, it will only get worse if you basically give yourself up to it. And you only need to do it once, because then you're in it the whole time. They've got you the whole time. Yeah,
no, definitely. One last question about the book is, they know that the book exists. Obviously, they knew that you reported on it. You talked to some of them throughout. How do they feel about the book, or specifically your role in this? Because you were their hype machine at times, right? Like that, when an athlete's doing well, you're their hype machine, as you said before, and then you turn into a journalist. Now it's hard news, and I need to report on the hard news. And then you take it a step further by writing an entire book on it. What's your relationship with some of these players at the moment, and kind of how do they feel about their faces being on the cover of a book, about this sort of topic?
I must say, when I told them, obviously I had dealings with a lot of them. Most of them were fine for the book. They were like, you could tell they were happy to get their side of the story across.
Yep.
I haven't spoken to all of them since. I'd say probably Kadir is the one that I've spoken to the most, because he's restarted his career now since. And he was like, fine, this is how it was. As long as I got the chance to give my side of the story, it's fine. And when he had his first match back in October, obviously it's quite an emotional thing for him. And I was there for it. And he was like, Paul, he actually, I mean, weirdly, he was like, there's a lot of people I want to thank for the support they've given me. Like Colonel Azam is the UAE's head of anti-corruption. He wanted to thank him. He wanted to thank all his friends. And he said, Paul, thanks. You didn't need to do this, like show my side of the story, but I appreciate that you did. I mean, I'm like, well, whatever. Like, it was a story to be told, but I'm glad he felt that way, because I just wanted to give them the right to reply, basically, and show their point of view. So if they're unhappy with having their face on the on the front of a book that says "plain and fixed," then that's understandable. But hopefully they can see it for what it was, and the fact that it was, took their view into account.
Thank you very much for writing the book and coming on the podcast.
Thanks very much for having me, Jared. I really appreciate it.